acclaim. He's the co-founder and director of the Weekly Standard. He has written for numerous news and other organizations, including Reader's Digest, the Sunday Times and the Sunday Telegraph of London, the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, and just to name a few. He's also no stranger to television. He co-hosted Fox News' The Beltway Boys and still appears regularly on Fox News and other major news networks. And he even made a small appearance in a personal favorite of mine, the 1996 movie Independence Day, where he was no less concerned about the destruction of the United States than he is today. What stood out to me the most, however, about Mr. Barnes is his faith. He's a man who proclaims what he believes, not in an intentionally offensive or otherwise odious manner, but in a firm and resolved way which inspires others to contemplate their own beliefs. Mr. Barnes proclaims a faith that is not first and foremost concerned with popularity or political correctness, but instead set upon the solid and unyielding rock of Scripture. He does not ignore the history of our faith and instead focus on some new fad interpretation or teaching, but he instead remains steadfast in the history and the rich teachings of the Bible itself. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming to the stage Mr. Fred Barnes.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here, and why don't we start with a prayer? Lord, thank you for bringing us here. Thank you for creating a nation like ours that is a light that shines on the whole world. And Lord, in particular today and after today, keep us reminded that there is one so important thing about America, and that is it's a nation under God. Amen. I'm not going to give a sermon. I don't have a sermon. And was that you, Hewitt, clapping? I did speak once, though, at a church on Sunday morning at their services at 9 and 11. This was a church in Pennsylvania that was having a pro-life Sunday. And I discovered this, that you're better the second time. But I'm sorry for you all, because this is the only time I'm going to give this speech. But I am glad to be here and see people like Bill Armstrong and others, and John Andrews, of course, that I've known for a long time, and they're always great to see. I'm going to talk about 3 men and 3 issues. The 3 men are Christians. You'll have heard of at least 2 of them, maybe not the third, and 3 issues which you'll be familiar with. And I hope you'll agree with me what we need to do regarding these 3 issues. I went to a conference maybe it's been about 9 or 10 months ago now, a conference on religion and politics. And if you ever want to get somebody in journalism to come to a conference, there's one trick, that's have it in Miami Beach. And of course I went. I'd have gone anyway. A friend of mine was putting it on. But anyway, I heard a man I'd read many of his essays and even one of his books speak. This was a man named Peter Berger. Peter Berger is 83 years old. He's a sociologist. He is an expert in the sociology of religion and also in the sociology of humor. He has a book on humor called Redeeming Laughter. It's a short book. I prefer short books. You can read them faster. And I recommend it to anybody. But at this conference, I asked him, well, why don't you tell us one of the humor stories in your book? And he did. He told this one. About a middle-aged fella goes in one day to have his physical, to see his doctor and get a physical, and then if you had one of these, then you go and sit down in the doctor's office and he tells you, you hope, that you're in great health. Certainly what this fellow expected. Instead, the doctor said, I have very bad news. You have 1 year to live. And of course, the guy was thunderstruck, shocked, and just didn't know what to say. And finally he said, Doctor, what can I do? And the doctor said, well, here's my advice. Marry a sociologist and move to North Dakota. And he said, well, doctor, how is that a cure? The doctor said, no, it's not a cure, but the year will go very slowly. So there is such a thing as sociologist humor. You know, here's another one you probably never heard of, Mitt Romney humor. Nobody's ever accused Mitt Romney of being the Will Rogers of American politics, that's for sure. Very nice man. I went to this retreat they had last weekend, and at an event I'm trying to think, New Hampshire. In the 2008 campaign, at one of these town hall meetings, Mitt Romney stopped in the middle of his address and said, I want to tell you a story. I wouldn't repeat it if it weren't Mitt Romney who had offered this story. And he said, this is a story about a married couple, each 50 years old, walking on the beach in Florida. And they come upon a lamp, one of those Aladdin lamps, out of which pops a genie. Look, I wouldn't be telling you this if it weren't Mitt Romney. It doesn't seem to have any automatic application to politics. But in any case, the genie says, each of you, the husband and the wife, each of you can have one wish. And I want you to, and I will grant it, and I will grant the thing that you have yearned for the most in life and never gotten. And the wife seems to know immediately what she wants, and she says, you know, I have traveled a lot, I've been to museums all over the world, and I've seen this incredible jewelry that was worn by Catherine the Great and Queen Elizabeth and Queen Victoria, and I'd like some of it, just like that. She's decked out in this incredible, beautiful, expensive jewelry. Well, the husband's there, and he's kind of kicking the sand and looking down, and the genie gets a little impatient and says, come on, come on. And the guy says, well, you know, I'm just embarrassed saying this in front of my wife. But here goes. I have always wanted to be married to a woman who's 30 years younger. Just like that. He's 80. That's pretty good. That's pretty good for Mitt Romney, don't you think? I've never heard him repeat it, but anyway. Peter Berger is important for one particular reason, and it's made him a leading scholar of religion in the world, and that is he was one of those, 40, 50 years ago, along with other sociologists who believed that the trend towards secularization in the world was inexorable. It was cooked in the cake. It was just going to continue. And then, after examining data over a period of time, he came to the opposite conclusion and said that I believe now that rather than secularization expanding, we now have religion is more vital around the world than almost any time in the past, and especially in the United States. Especially in the United States. And he is famous for one line in particular, Peter Berger is, regarding India as the most religious country in the world, as Sweden as the most secular, and he described America as a nation of Indians governed by Swedes. And it's true. We laugh, it's a good joke, that's why I repeated it, but it's painfully true. Now, the second person I want to mention is Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan has produced, well, most of them have come after he died, books in his own words, not written by speechwriters, not under the advice of anybody, but in his own words. There is radio addresses from the late 1990s and the scripts he wrote out in longhand. You'd recognize his handwriting. His diaries, very rich in information. His diary, he kept a diary for all 8 years of his presidency. Then there's a book of the declassified conversations or negotiations between Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev in Iceland in 1986. Fascinating. And those are Reagan off the cuff, but in his words. And you find so much. You find a completely different picture of Ronald Reagan. He's not the amiable dunce, as he was once called by Clark Clifford. He's not the lightweight. He is extremely knowledgeable. He is decisive. He is totally in charge. One of the secret documents that came out was one that says where he's talking to his National Security Council, the first meeting of it in 1981, and he says, I'm glad to have you all here. I cherish your advice, but I'll make all the decisions. And of course, he did. Now, in his autobiography, he's written two of them. The one in 1965, Where's the Rest of Me? And then one in 1990 called An American Life, which is pretty good, but he says something in there that I found surprising. I mean, I have gone to or read scores of Reagan speeches, hundreds, and read others. And he described in this book a joke he says was the one that he told the most. And he said it ought to be buried. He had told it more than any other joke. And I'd never heard it. I've heard lots of, Reagan's had a great sense of humor, but I hadn't heard this joke. And it goes like this. In Rome, 2,000 years ago, a group of Christians are rounded up and taken to the Colosseum and put in a pen and finally released out into the middle of the Colosseum where they can't escape, and then the lions are unleashed. They're in the lion's den. Huge crowd cheering for blood and violence. And the lions start moving on the Christians, and one man steps out from the group of Christians and says something to the lions, and they lie down. Well, the crowd goes berserk. They didn't come to see a bunch of lions sitting there near the Christians and being perfectly gentle. They didn't want that. So finally, the guy in charge, the Roman consul in charge, sends somebody down to ask the man, "What in the world did you say to those lions?" And he says, "I told them after they eat, there will be speeches." Now, doesn't that sound like Ronald Reagan? I read that. I've repeated it in every speech I've given since then. Anyway, it's the diaries that are the most revealing. And the diaries, to my surprise, Reagan talks in there about praying. He prays almost every day and mentions it. He prays for his wife. He prays for himself, for courage and steadfastness and strength, and to do the right thing. He prays for others. He prays for the country. He is constantly in contact with God. I really had no idea. I know he's always described himself as a Christian, and he's talked about it, but the depth of his Christianity I found really extraordinary, because I'd been a little dubious of his faith. In 1984, I was one of the panelists on the first Reagan-Mondale televised debate. It's in Louisville, Kentucky, on a Sunday night. And with a friend of mine named Tom DeFrank, who worked with Newsweek, we devised a question that I asked that we thought would surely surprise Reagan on a subject he never would have thought that anybody would have asked about. And the question was, how come you don't go to church? And Reagan answered that, well, the security problems and it would create turmoil and so on. I thought it was a pretty weak answer, but then we moved on. Now that was 1984, jump to last year, or maybe early this year, when I was reading Reagan's diaries. Turned out this was an issue he'd been concerned about all along. He wanted to go to church. And the Secret Service said, if we announce it ahead of time, then we can't guarantee you security, and it will create turmoil at the church and so on. And Reagan talked about this a half a dozen times, maybe more, in his diaries, and finally came to figure out that if he showed up at the last minute, a potential assassins couldn't show up and the church wouldn't get all in a hubbub, and that's what he did. He did start going to church. Well, imagine how I felt. Well, I felt embarrassed. Here I thought I'd sprung one on Reagan and pulled one on him and surprised. I mean, look, this is one of the stupid things you try to do in journalism, but anyway, you do it. I'm sure Bill Armstrong understands this. You try to ask questions of some politician that he or she doesn't expect. Well, Reagan knew all about this. He'd gone through this. He'd thought about this. He'd prayed about this. And so I wound up being embarrassed. Third person, Chuck Colson, an amazing man. Of course, he was a Watergate criminal, as he was always the first to tell you. He formed Prison Fellowship, which exists today in over 100 countries. He was a great evangelist and a whole lot more. He died in April, 80 years old, and his impact on people was on countless people, thousands of people, not just prisoners, on people like me. It was really breathless. I mean, it's just amazing to contemplate the impact he had on so many people. When I became a Christian 30 years ago, I was kind of a secret Christian for a while. About 4 years. But his example of someone, his first book was called Born Again. I feared if I would be labeled a born-again Christian. And I didn't like what I was, but I just didn't think that would be helpful. Well, the example of Chuck Colson being such a public figure about his faith and his born-again Christianity was certainly an encouragement to me, and I know of others that it was and probably still is. And then I would get calls occasionally from Chuck Colson, and he'd invite me to do something. I always said yes, to come give a talk about how I became a Christian and being in journalism and Christianity and so on. And half a dozen times I always went. It was always a delight to be with an ex-Marine who was really on fire for Christ. And he had very strong views about the role of our faith in public life. Let me read you from a letter he wrote to Prison Fellowship donors. Here's what he said. I believe that for too long we Christians have looked at our faith as simply a devotional relationship or as church-going. In short, just one part of our life. But the fact is that our God is Lord of all and His people, and as His people we must articulate His truth in every area of life. And boy, did he follow that. I mean, he really is my idea of what muscular Christianity is all about. And, of course, he was, as that quote suggests, his two greatest concerns were, well, I guess three when you add in bringing prisoners and inmates and others to Christ. He was very interested in expanding the Christian witness in the public square, and also setting in motion efforts to instill the Christian worldview in our country, around the world, and especially in professed Christians. A remarkable guy. Now, what do all these guys have in common, other than the fact that they were all serious followers of Jesus Christ, and that their faith had obviously shaped so much of their lives, and their faith was defining for them. Certainly for Chuck Colson, but also for Ronald Reagan and Peter Berger. All three of them were extremely gracious and humble people. Karl Rove, after Chuck Colson died, was interviewed by Christianity Today, and he knew Chuck Colson and who lobbied the White House on issues that Colson was interested in, faith-based initiatives and many other things. And here's what Karl Rove, a guy I know well who doesn't hand out compliments very often, said Colson was one of the most kind and gentle and thoughtful human beings I ever met. Kind and gentle and thoughtful. That was Chuck Colson. Reagan, Berger, and Colson were not self-absorbed, were not narcissistic. They were leaders. Berger had many followers that he generated in academia for his view of religion and his newfound discovery that religion was bursting at the seams around the world, especially in the U.S. But as I say, Ronald Reagan, I have a book here. This is called Ronald Reagan, The Notes. Ronald Reagan would come upon quotes that he liked, and he'd write them out in longhand on note cards. And they were found just a couple years ago and collected in this book. These are not Ronald Reagan's writings, but these are note cards he had with quotes that he would pull out and use in speeches. He had them cataloged, I believe. Here's one of them that's attributed to Anonymous, but it tells you a lot about Reagan, and I also think about Colson and Berger. You cannot pray the Lord's Prayer and even once say, I. You cannot pray the Lord's Prayer and even once say, my. You cannot pray the Lord's Prayer and not include another. You cannot ask for daily bread and not include your brother. For others are included in each and every plea. From the very beginning, it never once says, me. This is from some Christian reader that he found and is attributed to Anonymous. That Reagan found that so meaningful is quite telling, I think. And indeed he did. Now, I believe one of the reasons I put these three people together, and I knew all three of them, and Peter Berger's still alive at age 83, I believe they embody or reflect or represent, or all three, the idea of one nation under God. As I think we all know, it doesn't mean we should have an established religion or that we become a Christian nation. Obviously, we're a nation of many, many Christians, but it means that we're in God's hands. The fate of our country is in God's hands, and He's looking out for us. It's a nation that's under God's guidance. You know, the person that who talked about this and prayed about this the most was Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War, asking God to intervene, and he wrote and talked about God's providence. And of course, it's been disputed whether he was even a Christian. In fact, he was, or became one during the Civil War, because evangelical Christians from all over the country, well, from the North, would come and visit him. There's actually their whole books written about the enormous impact they had on Abraham Lincoln. And he prayed a lot. He prayed for America to recover from the Civil War, and it ultimately did after he had died. Well, let me turn to part two, these issues. Chuck Colson was one of the three drafters of the Manhattan Declaration, which was promulgated in 2009. Some of you all may be familiar with it. The other writers of it were Robert George of Princeton University, a Catholic, and Tim George of Samford University in Birmingham, Alabama, who was the chief speaker or eulogist at the memorial service in Washington for Chuck Colson. The Manhattan Declaration is 9 pages long. It's very easy to obtain. I just got a copy. I Googled Manhattan Declaration, and there it was, and I printed it. And it's really worth reading. It's not too long, as I say, 9 pages. And it focuses on 3 issues that they argue, and something like 2,000 others, mainly priests and others, politicians, and those in seminaries and so on, like Albert Mohler at the Louisville Seminary, Baptist Seminary, about 3 issues that they said were of Christian moral concern, and that they believe ought to be front and center in politics and in the public square. 3 issues. And I would add, and this is what I'm going to advocate, as they would, they ought to be front and center in this election this year, the 2012 election, certainly at the presidential level and also at lower Senate, House, and governor's races. Here's the way in the Manhattan Declaration they outline these issues. because the sanctity of human life, the dignity of marriage as a union of husband and wife, and the freedom of conscience and religion are foundational principles of justice and the common good, we are compelled by our Christian faith to speak and act in their defense. We are Christians who have joined together across historic lines of ecclesiastical differences to affirm our right, and more importantly, to embrace our obligation, which is in italics, our obligation to speak and act in defense of those truths. It is our duty to proclaim the gospel of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ in its fullness, both in season and out of season. May God help us not to fail in that duty. Well, what they're talking about here, obviously, is abortion, same-sex marriage, and religious liberty. Religious liberty having been violated since that came out in 2009 by the Obama administration's coercion of Christians and violating their conscience with these new regulations. Let me mention a couple of other things that Chuck Colson said in the final speech he gave at the Wilberforce weekend conference. I'm not sure where it was. This was March 30. He must have died about 10 days later. And he said these two things. Societies are changed by movements at the grassroots, and elections can't solve the problem we've got, which he, of course, says is a cultural problem. Now, I think both of those things are true, but there are two other things that are true, and they are that political campaigns can promote and legitimize grassroots movements. We saw this happen in 2010 with the Tea Party all over the country, and then the result of the election. The whole Tea Party movement was certainly legitimized to the dismay of many liberal critics. And elections can ratify the agenda, the ideas, the plans of these grassroots groups. And that can certainly happen in 2012. Now, did Colson agree with my addendum to what he said? Well, I don't know. Never asked him, never had a chance to ask him. I bet he would, but that's just speculation. Let me start with abortion. If there is ever a grassroots movement that is looked down upon by elites and much of Washington and certainly the elite culture in America, it's the pro-life movement, which has reached great new success in the last several years. Despite that, there's been a resurgence. You go to a pro-life march now, and particularly the one in Washington, and it's almost all young people. I remember when it was all geezers, aging Catholics and then old Protestants who finally joined in. And it wasn't the liveliest event in town. Now it is. There's a famous story about the woman who was the head of NARAL, the pro-abortion group, arriving on a train at Union Station, which is right near where the pro-life march is every January, and looking at it and saying, there's so many of them, and they're so young. And they are so young. And we have a pro-life movement with no help. A pro-life movement that's been incredibly successful and growing without any help from folks higher up on the social ladder, that's for sure, or not help from many of them. They're younger, they're entrepreneurial, they're strategic in their thinking, they're ambitious, they're better organized, and one of the great traits they have is they are relentless. And you talk to these pro-abortion people, and they have worn them down. They are crushing Planned Parenthood. Certainly well-deserved. They immediately seized the high moral grounds once sonograms were able to produce great resolution, and you could see it's a baby. I remember the first ones with one of my kids when she had a sonogram, my wife would say, well, here's this, that, and I couldn't make out anything on it. But now, with my grandchildren, the resolution is fantastic. They're babies. They're girls and boys. You can see all of this stuff. The sonograms are powerful. It's great to have science on your side. There are now 3 pregnancy centers, to take women who are pregnant and they're thrown out of their homes or something, and then help them. And most of them then, particularly after sonograms, decide to have children rather than an abortion. Crisis pregnancy centers. There are 3 of those for every abortion clinic in America now. 3. That's remarkable. This is a grassroots movement that has been successful and needs to be supported and ratified by the political system, by us, by Republicans, by conservatives, by Christians. It's time for that now. And I think Chuck Colson would agree. I hope so. Same-sex marriage. There are so many people I know, conservatives, and maybe there's some of you here, and I'm subject to this from time to time, to give up on this issue. I mean, here, elites in Hollywood and television, where there's a gay person on every show, I'm told. I only watch sports these days, safer. Elites have just completely capitulated on this whole issue. And we're told, look, this is history, we're moving on, gay marriage is just and gay rights are just a part of what we're going to have in America. And yet, and there are polls. There are polls that show this, that show a trend in favor of public acceptance of gay marriage. Well, polls don't lie. They reflect what people have told them, but they don't necessarily tell the truth. And in this case, I think they don't. A great example of this was in North Carolina a few weeks ago in the primary election, where they had a referendum on enacting a husband and a wife as the only form of marriage into the state constitution. Polls showed it was going to win, but then it won in a landslide of 22 percentage points. Huge landslide in favor of it. In North Carolina, a state that Obama won in 2008. Narrowly, but he won it. There are now 28 states that bar same-sex marriage, 6 that have approved it. That's a pretty big disparity. And then there's the third issue of religious liberty, which is certainly a grassroots issue, and it stretches from Colorado Christian University to the Catholic bishops to the Weekly Standard to all over the country. It's an issue people understand. When you're forcing religious people to abandon their beliefs and do things that violate their beliefs. We've always had conscience clauses in legislation and in programs until now. And this was done purposely. This wasn't an accident by the Obama administration. This was done with malice aforethought, on purpose, and at least in large part to please liberals and feminists who are part of the coalition that President Obama thinks will reelect him and might reelect him. I don't know. And it's not just an attack on the conscience of Christians. I believe it's an attack on Christianity itself. If you can so undermine Christians in public life, at hospitals and universities and so on, you can undermine Christianity. And you remove this buffer that's so important, where religion, and Christianity in particular, is a buffer between the state and individuals. We see all these buffers eliminated, or were eliminated, in communist countries. We see it now in Cuba. America's had many of these buffers, and this would remove one of them. Now, as conservatives and as Christians, and most importantly, as conservative Christians, which I think we all are, or we'd be somewhere else today, I believe we are obligated to embrace these 3 social issues. And do all we can to make them part of the 2012 campaign. Well, this is probably easier for me than it is for you, because I can write something in the Weekly Standard. Since I'm one of the founders, I can write anything I want, and it'll get in the magazine. And this is something we have written about and will continue to write about. But there's another factor. These issues provide a political benefit for conservatives and Republicans. They are popular issues. If you remember back to the Gallup poll that first in 2009 found that a majority of Americans identify themselves as pro-life. They are opposed to abortion. 51%, and it may have grown since then, while only 42% consider themselves pro-choice, which, of course, pro-choice, what does that mean? It means you're pro-abortion. So there's a majority there. Many of these are people who will vote for conservative candidates only because they are pro-life. We found this, I remember going to Iowa during the caucuses in Iowa in 1980, and the pro-lifers there were Democrats. And then they changed because the Democratic Party became a pro-abortion party and the Republican Party became a pro-life party. It's also true, as I mentioned, of support for traditional marriage. Polls show this, but mainly elections show it, and activity and what legislatures have done, and the North Carolina primary referendum, and so on, show that Americans want to preserve the integrity of marriage. While they may respect, I'm really not trying to throw in applause lines, but feel free. That's quite all right. And there's tremendous support across the country. I think every poll shows for conscience clauses. Now, you may believe that exploiting the weak economy we have in this country, the lack of job creation, the slow economic growth, the rising debt, the surging deficit, and opposing Obamacare, that those two issues, that's all we need. That'll put the Senate in Republican hands and conservative hands, and President Obama will be defeated from the White House. And you may be right. I doubt it, but you may be right. That may be enough. But I happen to think you're wrong. And in any case, it would be awfully risky to do this. Very risky. Politically risky. For one thing, you would ignore huge constituencies of social conservatives who aren't necessarily Republicans or conservatives on other issues or in favor of free markets and so on. There are many, many out there, millions and millions of voters. Ignoring them would be a tremendous mistake. Now, we've heard, I love this, a euphemism that, well, the Republican Party has to be a big tent. Unfortunately, a big tent means a smaller tent. What they mean is we don't want to hear from any of these people who are against abortion or against same-sex marriage, who want to talk about other issues like religious liberty and so on. We don't want them because they'll scare away some other voters. And maybe they will scare away a few, but they will come in millions on their own. So ignoring them would be a mistake. And brushing aside, to the relief of our opponents, the idea that brought us here today would also be a mistake. And that idea is one that needs to last and we need to acknowledge year after year after year, and that is that we are indeed one nation under God. Thank you very much. Thank you.